Good evening, everyone. I'm very humbled and grateful for the opportunity to speak with you and talk about something that's near and dear to my heart. As you've heard, I'm a psychiatrist by training, and very recently my professional journey took a very unexpected turn as I was appointed Chief Wellness Officer for the university. And this past academic year has been fraught with challenges, unexpected challenges, but mostly with unexpected and very rewarding surprises. And for those of you who are on Penn's campus, you've heard of James' signature course, The Pursuit of Happiness. I'm hoping you also heard about the Big Idea Challenge, where we invited the Penn community to submit suggestions of how we can enhance wellness on campus. We received 450 submissions. We were hoping for 100, so it became stressful to pick the finalists. And we had a pitch event last Thursday, and we funded 3 pilots for next year. I share this with you because as I was given a very daunting mandate to become the first Chief Wellness Officer, translation, I had no one to call to say, hey, how do you do this? Because there was no one before. There was wonderful momentum available on campus. I didn't start from scratch. I already had a team of allies who were innovative, who were very diligent and dedicated to taking care of wellness. But it brings me back to today's topic, which is about mental health. I'm going to purposely say something controversial and say that's a terrible title. But let me explain, because I'd be a really terrible guest right now. The reason I'm challenging you to think differently is because why is mental health different than physical health? Like, who decided that they were separate? Why do we have 2 silos? Why have we decided to talk about one separately? Why is one stigmatized but not the other? No one wonders whether or not they should get their knee checked out if they twisted it playing football. They go to student health and they get their knee checked out. And they talk about it with their friends. And they have no shame or fear walking around with an elastic bandage and a pack of ice and going for physical therapy and asking to be absent from class to go to physical therapy. But if someone is struggling with debilitating anxiety because it's really hard to be in a classroom with a bunch of strangers because this inner voice is so negative and judgmental that it becomes paralyzing. Why is that individual wondering whether it's okay to go to CAPS, whether it's okay to share and express this vulnerability, whether it's okay to schedule appointments or maybe even take medications if it's appropriate or indicated? Why do we treat 2 symptoms that are part of the normal human experience differently? We shouldn't. We should collectively decide that it's the same thing, that it's part of our overall health, and the distinction we make between physical health and mental health, while very practical and handy, right? It's really nice to organize things in little compartments, but I think we do ourselves a disservice when we continue to propagate this false dichotomy between mental health and physical health. Now you figured out that I said you had a bad title event just to give myself an excuse to talk about what the core of the problem is. There's no reason why we should make this distinction. The more we do, the more we become complicit in further stigmatizing conditions that don't need to. You know what happens to our students is they get to the intersection of 36th and Market, and they're like, do I cross Market Street and go to student health? Or do I turn left and walk down Market Street and go to CAPS? Why do they have to choose which place they go to? Why do we have 2 different clinics? Like, why don't you go to a healthcare place where you have a symptom and a healthcare professional makes a clinical decision and says, you know, this person is best equipped, has the skills and tools to take care of your need. Or, you know, all this GI stuff and this sleep stuff, it's probably generalized anxiety disorder. We have people who have skills and tools who can help you quiet that very judgmental, negative voice that paralyzes you. That is what I wish the narrative would be on college campuses. The grown-ups that are around you, they're kind of stuck in a narrative that was handed to them, and it's changed. It's much, much better than it used to be, but it can be better still, and that's on you. You will lead the charge. You will change the narrative. You will break the silos, and you will look at health as a unified list of problems that are on a spectrum, not on two categories that operate separately in two different silos. Those are the thoughts that I wanted to share with you. When we talk about mental health, we need to think bigger, we need to think differently, and we certainly should not silo ourselves as we want to tackle and make these things better. Those are the opening remarks I wanted to share with you. Here's to hear from my friends and panelists, but I'm hoping we can engage in dialogue together later about how this resonates with you. You can tell me that I'm completely off here, but I would welcome the opportunity for us to talk about this. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I'll add to that just a couple of words from our perspective in the chaplain's office. So I've been in the chaplain's office now for about 10 years. And it's an interesting role on a campus like Penn's. But I also want to quickly describe what it is, because you may be wondering what that looks like on a place like Penn. We do two main things out of the chaplain's office. The first is that we're an informal and confidential place for any member of the Penn community, faculty, staff, or student, to come and just speak with somebody about anything that they're dealing with. So we're part of this wide range of wellness resources on Penn's campus, and always a place that you can come. How many people have ever visited our space in Houston Hall? I know at least a few. Great. Our space is in Houston Hall, 240 Houston Hall. It's up on the second floor. It does take a little bit of investigating to find it the first time that you come, but once you visit, I think you'll find it to be a warm and comforting and welcoming space. People come and hang out to study and just catch up with friends as well. So that's one part of our role, is that we're part of the wellness team at the university, and we work with everybody here and all the other offices around campus as well. The second piece is that we work with all of the religious and spiritual communities on campus, so that's how I've gotten to know Patrick and Nelson, Father Carlos, and also Gabby and John, and some of the leaders here as well. And really, we know that we're doing well with that work when we see communities like yours really functioning like this, as a place to come together, to get to know one another, to speak truth to one another, to care for one another, around tables like you do every Thursday, in Bible studies and other spaces that you have on campus. We want to be encouraging of the work that you guys are already doing, because we know that creating that kind of community is one of the fundamental things that supports wellness on our campus. So thank you all for that work that you're doing. Thank you all, the staff, the student leaders, and all of you who just make this a priority as a place to be. It's really foundational to this work of wellness. And so I think I want to say a couple of things about, I'll follow the theme of sort of silos and things that are separated. Often our spiritual spaces and our counseling spaces are thought of as separate. We think we may have some spiritual issues, we may have some mental health issues, and we don't always connect those things. And I'll speak as a Christian coming from working in a church setting. Sometimes we see dynamics where people feel like, if something's wrong with me in my spiritual space, it must mean there's something I'm doing wrong. I'm not praying hard enough, I'm not going to church enough, I'm not doing something I should be doing. And there's not enough space, I think, sometimes for us to talk and holistically and say, hey, there may be a bunch of different things going on. And maybe part of it is, it'd be great to be a part of your spiritual community in more ways. Maybe there's some ways that community can support you. But then also, as the church, can we make it clear about the different ways that counseling services, mental health services, the kinds of holistic health care that Benoit is talking about is also available and readily available. And I can tell you my experience in the church is that that's not always, there's been a stigma around that. That's not always been as supported as perhaps it could be. So I'm very free and willing to talk about my own experience of going to counseling and finding real benefit and value in that. And I think that's something that we need in our communities to do more talking about, to decrease some of that stigma, of sense of, hey, if I need that, that must mean there's something wrong with me. So I wanted to say that piece. The other thing is that, as this conversation has shifted on campus to talking more broadly about wellness, We're recognizing that we're not talking about a simple binary of you're either sick or you're well, or you're sick or you're healthy. But there's a broad range of what wellness can mean. That it's also, there are ways we can be working on our wellness even if we're not in what we might call sickness. Does that make sense? There's a range going from, I know some of your students, James, will talk about this ratio of going from like a spectrum of it's not just from you're either sick back to zero and now we're okay, but there's space on the other end to grow and learn together as well. So in this new conversation about wellness, that's something that we can all be a part of, we can all be thinking about in our daily lives. And so our work in the chaplain's office, we've been thinking about this in terms of spiritual wellness, which is maybe a different way of thinking about or conceiving or starting from getting to what is really one big conversation about our overall health. So there's really two components that we've been thinking a lot about in terms of spiritual wellness. I can say more about this if people have questions when we get into more of a discussion. But those two things are really encouraging people to find spaces that are reflective on campus, places where they actually have a chance to sit and think about the big questions in life, the things that matter to them, the things that give them purpose and meaning in whatever it is that they're doing. I'm sure you find that here at Newman. I know I've had conversations with some of you about the ways that you find that here at Newman. I know that for me, a lot of that happens in my church community. And then the other piece is to look for encouraging people in what I would broadly call spiritual practices. The kinds of things that we can do, small kind of repeatable things like prayer, like meditation, like meeting together, like taking intentional time outside, like service and the kind of things that you guys were doing in Peru, that actually fundamentally change our approach to our days. So I was at a conference in Albuquerque with Richard Rohr, the Franciscan friar. Yeah, that was my reaction when I heard he was going to be there. And a lot of what he talks about is the contemplative mind. His sense is that our modern institutions teach us a lot about critical thinking and what he calls a dualistic mind, which is a much more analytical frame of reference and way of being. A lot of our days are spent in that mindset. And another way of looking at it, another frame of looking at the world is through the contemplative mind, which allows us to reflect and see the space that we live in for what it is. And really, the important takeaway that I had from his message was this is something that we can train in. It's something that he teaches and encourages through spiritual practices. Trying something out for a few minutes here and there and building a practice like that can actually help you reframe how you look at the world. And we're seeing, and I don't have the expertise that some of my colleagues here have in some of the science behind this, but we're seeing in the study of neurology a lot of really interesting things about how our stress responses can be managed by things like mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is a meditation practice, and I think also extends to some of what Father Rohr is talking about in training the contemplative mind. So I can say more about spiritual wellness if that's an interesting topic.
Thanks, Steve. Can everyone hear me? I talk really soft, so gotcha. I guess by show of hands, are there Drexel students here as well? Okay, I'll try not to be too Penn specific. But my name is Laura Collins, and I'm one of the therapists at CAPS. And I don't think it's accidental that we all, without talking, sort of are coming with the same idea and theme. But first I should say that I went to Catholic schools my entire life, and I'm a proud graduate of the Catholic University of America. So can't have had a more Catholic-based education than what I've had. And I think that I never thought I would work at a college counseling center. And the more that I've been here, I often go back and think about my experience in college. And I think about how some of the most wonderful experiences I had were those late night conversations, talking about existential ideas and the meaning of life and connecting with friends. And that was just really rejuvenating and shaped a lot of how I think about my life. And I also think about some of the more painful parts of college were starting to realize how certain friends started to experience mental health concerns, or were going through a traumatic experience, or dealing with loss. And I began to sort of really experience how isolating college can be, that even though you're surrounded by maybe a community of friends or a community of people, that things can get really dark really quickly. And I think that working at CAPS, what I would share with you, and even for those at Drexel, I know Dr. Kristen Birch, who works there, she's a great point of contact if you're looking for someone, is that the hardest thing is just deciding to pick up the phone or walk in the door. I'm part of the team that answers the phone or meets with any student who comes in, and I really think about that as more customer service. And what I'm inviting students into is an introduction into what I think is the biggest component of mental wellness, is learning how to reach out for help when things feel really hard and you're not sure where to turn to. And a good counselor can help you begin to untangle what might feel really hard in your life. I always think of a student who I met with who told me that they had walked up and down Market Street 8 times trying to decide whether or not they should come in to CAPS. And I've heard that in different ways over the years. And it does make me start to wonder, like, am I a scary and intimidating person? I can barely hear myself talk. I talk so quietly, but I've learned that it is incredibly intimidating to just sometimes walk in the door. And that is, I think, the most victorious moment that one can have in your life, is to do the walk. Sometimes it's 18 times, sometimes it's 8 years. But that help is available, and I think that counseling, and what I guess my idea of mental wellness and wellness in general, is moving toward integration. And I work with a lot of students who just want a problem maybe to go away, or they don't ever want to be sad, or they don't want to have a crisis of faith, or they don't want to feel guilty. And I think when you look around and you think of people in your life who look really well and seem really well, is that there's a balance, that there is bad times, but during those times there's some kind of balance of our spiritual selves, our intellectual selves, our emotional selves, our relational selves. And when we confront problems in our lives, sometimes something has gotten over-prioritized or undernourished. And sometimes just talking through that with another person can make a huge difference. And when I look back at college and I look at different friends, people that really thrived and are really living like their best life, as maybe the young people say, they take care of themselves. You know, they go for runs, they spend time with friends, and whether or not it's religious, they do something with their spiritual, reflective energy. Maybe that's just going on a vacation, sitting by a lake. Other people might be going to a religious service. So I just want to encourage, just for all of you, if you haven't thought about talking to a counselor and you're hurting, that having that happen in isolation and in private and in secrecy usually makes it worse. It's kind of like mold. So shining a little bit of light on it can seem really scary and really overwhelming, but it does get better, it can get better. So I just encourage all of you to think about reaching out if you need any support. Encourage your friends to reach out for support. And myself and my colleague in the back, Nicole, we have stickers and brochures, and Nicole is also on our team that if you call or walk in, we're always there every Wednesday night until 7 o'clock. So if you need a friendly face, you guys can come find us. So thank you.
So it's great to be back again. It's great to be a part of the Newman dinners, although I have to admit I'm now 0 for 2 in predicting the Newman dinners, because the first time we were here was the coldest day of like the entire year. And as Susie and I were heading over, we're like, oh my word, what bad scheduling of this cold day. Nobody's gonna show up. And people showed up. And so today I'm like, oh my goodness, reading days, Penn's reading days, like nobody's gonna show up. There's not gonna be anybody there, and you guys are here. So well done. It's great to see you. It's an honor to be here. One of the problems about being the last speaker on a really good panel is there's not really much left for me to say. But I'm actually a philosopher, so that doesn't really stand in the way. So I'll try to keep my remarks under an hour here. Way under an hour, Patrick. But I want to begin by picking up a point that Benoit started on and then tying it in with something Steve said. This term, mental health, I think one of the problems with the term, in addition to this idea that, well, mental as opposed to physical as opposed to, is that also we say mental health, but we're really thinking mental illness, right? And so I don't want to admit to being mentally ill. Therefore, I'm not going to think about mental health. And I'm not going to talk about it because this is a thing that I don't want to. And it turns out that, again, as Steve was saying, there's this whole range. I mean, mental health is something that all of us are concerned with, or should be concerned with. It touches all of us. Whether we are at the moment feeling or have some kind of struggle that might on some diagnosis be mental illness or not, mental health is something that is for all of us. So this morning, I went to the gym and I exercised. And I was trying, so the reason I did this, by the way, is because I taught this class on the pursuit of happiness. And a reason why I taught the class is because I wanted to take it. And so it's nice to see some of the folks from the class here. And one of the requirements that I had in the class was that you had to exercise 75 minutes a week, and you had to meditate 10 minutes a day. So there were a lot of mornings when I would have stayed in bed or done something else, but I had committed to my students that I was taking the class too. So I couldn't really expect from them what I wasn't willing to require of myself. Which is a way of, again, reinforcing the point of community. It can be tough to be on your own, trying all kinds of willpower. I'm gonna do it. If you're connected into other people who are supporting each other, that can make things a lot easier. So this idea of mental health as something that we do, covering whether we're ill at the moment or not ill at the moment, or whatever our state is something we should pay attention to. I want to talk about one particular topic that was in the announcement that I got tonight, and it talked about how acknowledging that being a college student can bring a lot of stress, isolation, depression, and so forth. And I think there's one term in there that to my mind is different from the other terms. I think we could all agree that depression is not something that we would choose. And if we do find ourselves struggling with it, going in and seeing Laura, one of her colleagues, is a great thing to do. I think we would all agree that isolation is not something we would choose, which I think is probably why you're here. But the word stress is something that we all choose, all the time. I mean, imagine a life with no stress. None. Your body can't function without stress. In fact, when I went to the gym for my health, I purposely put stress on the machine so that it would stress my body, right? Now imagine if I think that stress is a bad thing. Well, actually, imagine if I think that exercising to the point of having an increased heart rate and sweating is a bad thing. Then what will happen if I go to the gym and I start exercising and my heart rate starts to go up and I start to sweat? This is dangerous, I've got to stop. So I'm gonna get off that machine, I'm gonna calmly, lie down for a while until I can. So imagine if we think of stress as always being a bad thing. Then anytime I feel challenged, I'm not sure what I'm doing, I don't know if this is the right way or not, I might say, oh, I'm under stress, I've got to pull back, I've got to stop. And we might then distract ourselves from the challenges that we all face that are important, or we might try to cope in other kinds of ways by numbing ourselves or isolating ourselves from the challenge and so forth. So there are a lot of different kinds of stress. Obviously, some kinds of stress are not good. So I'm not saying that all stress is equal. But it's important to know, so if I'm at the gym and I'm doing some weights and I feel the pressure of the weight against my arm, that's fabulous, and I lean into it, right? If I then feel my shoulder pop, I do not say, yeah, stress, I love it! No, I stop, I see what's going on. Maybe I then go into, see a doctor to see what I've done with it. So there are different kinds of stress, but my concern is if we all lump it together under, oh my goodness, this is something we have to avoid, because it's actually a healthy part of life. And I'll just close with one term that I just recently learned that I think it's a really great term. And the term is anti-fragile. Any of you heard of the term anti-fragile? Okay, so a couple of you have, right? So the idea is that if someone is robust, or a system is robust, they can avoid failure. If a system is resilient, it can come back from failure. If a system is anti-fragile, it needs failure in order to survive and grow. So think about your immune system. Your immune system is anti-fragile. If you had been protected from all infections from the beginning of your life until now, you would be in grave danger. Because your immune system wouldn't have been trained up on how to protect you from the infections that are around us right now. But we don't worry about them because our immune system has learned how to protect ourselves. And so, the author Talib is somebody who's written this book on anti-fragility, and it applies to systems and physics and a lot of different things. It applies to the human beings. So we need to have stress. We need to have times where, this semester, I've been stressed. How many of you have been stressed? How many of you are stressed, like right now, if you think about it? There's plenty to be stressed about. I certainly do, right? And it's not just because I'm thinking about tomorrow morning at the gym again, right? And thank goodness. So the question becomes, to my mind, how do we choose the stress? How do we choose to respond to the stress? How are we able to identify when the stress becomes damaging and you got to stop and take a look at things? And when does it become just part of the natural process of growing and becoming stronger as a human being?
We're going to open up the questions for the entire room, and we only have one mic that the panel is going to use, so if anyone has a question, just stand up and ask it, and yeah, that's what we'll start with first. So does anyone have any questions to start for any of the four members of the panel?
Okay, this will start out. So I had therapy on mental health abuse, and I found therapy very beneficial. But I have a friend outside this wider community who has, and has before we met, had therapy, and it hasn't been beneficial, which I think was more about the dynamic that she had with the counselor in question. How do you help people who, it might not be the case, that getting counseling is the best course of action? I mean, not necessarily like a person not in the field trying to counsel, because it's way too much for a person to take on that burden if they're not trained in it. It's not good for them. And that's not what my friend has ever asked me, but I'm just curious.
Thanks, it's a great question. I always share with people that therapy is not that dissimilar from dating, minus all the fun parts. But that sometimes, like you're saying, the dynamic just doesn't connect. And, that's one of the benefits of CAPS. It's one of the larger counseling centers, is that we have so many different kinds of therapists with different kinds of identities, and that you can develop a different connection. But I think what I would encourage a friend is just to not give up on the process. Like, I like to let students know that I may or may not be the best fit for you, that we might not connect in the way that you're hoping for, but that I will do whatever it takes for them to connect with someone else. And like anything, like working out, like sometimes it's not the right gym or the kind of style of fitness that you want, and then you discover you love swimming. And we have a lot of services at CAPS, including mindfulness-based stress reduction. There's lots of very intense services, lots of things that are easier, lighter, that may feel more tolerable to someone just starting out in therapy. But in thinking about wellness as this bigger picture, that maybe they need to start with trying wellness in a different avenue and kind of working their way into therapy. But any college counseling center can help someone think about how to get the support that they need. But it is really painful, and it can stay with someone for their entire life if they have a bad experience in therapy.
Just to continue the dating analogy, we've all had bad dates, but we didn't just have one date, right? Then we went on and we dated other people, and then we found the right match. So just because it doesn't work out the first time doesn't mean it's not going to work. And to your question about, like, does your friend become your responsibility? Of course not. But you are a good friend because you're looking out for this person. You're bringing the question to us. And never underestimate the healing properties that you bring through the relationship that you have with this person. Sometimes just being present and listening without judgment, supporting and validating someone's emotions is very, very powerful. And we all have that innate ability to do this for each other. You have not become your friend's therapist, but you have been a part of your friend's journey, and you have been a component of her healing process, right? And you should not underestimate and forget what you're able to bring to this.
So there's a lot of talk about mental and physical not being separate. So do you know what Penn's trying to do to integrate SHS and CAPS right now?
I think that was, yeah. I happen to know that very well. So I'm just going to say 10 years, right? There will no longer be the dilemma when you get to 30 cents a market, do I go this way or do I go that way? So ultimately, there is the desire to, at the very least, have co-located care so that we have one waiting area for everybody. So whether you have a sprained ankle or debilitating anxiety, you go to the same place in the same clinic. But we aren't there just yet. So the first pilot at better integrating and taking a more holistic approach is going to happen this fall, and we're going to bring in CAPS clinicians into the student health space. So we're going to have CAPS clinicians, we will call them behavioral health consultants, just because for accrediting purposes, you have to use different titles, but they will be mental health professionals who will be there as consultants in the student health space. So if you do go to student health and you have GI issues, and it's determined that it's probably an excessive amount of anxiety that is creating this, rather than tasking you with making an appointment to see a CAPS clinician across the street when they're available, there will be a warm handoff to a CAPS clinician, a behavioral health consultant, who will be there and who can transition immediately in real time and address your needs. And maybe you have insomnia. Well, the behavioral health consultant can see you for 3 visits at student health. So this is the approach we're taking. It's a pilot. It's going to be rolled out in the next academic year, and we're actually renovating the space to be able to do this. So we're going to move administrative spaces out of student health. We're going to move them down into the mezzanine. The mezzanine will now be part of our wellness portfolio. That will create space for CAPS clinicians, behavioral health consultants. So we'll be able to have a more integrated approach. It's the first step. And then we'll see. We'll see how students feel about it. We'll see how clinicians feel about it. And this is the first step we're taking when you come back in September or August.
Do any of you know what resources there are on Drexel's campus?
What's Drexel?
You're not invited back.
I mean, I don't know a lot, but like I said, I'm familiar with one of the psychologists who works there. She actually trained with us at CAPS, and she's pretty awesome. She runs the outreach programming at Drexel's College Counseling Center. So they do similar things as us. They provide individual therapy, group therapy, and they do outreach on campus. I think they have a much smaller counseling center and as many, if not more students, I'm not sure. So I know that sometimes it can feel really hard, even harder than Penn, to kind of get in and maybe get therapy started. But I know they also can help people get connected to outside referrals. So that's what I know about Drexel's counseling.
I'm going to ask a question for, I just had a couple that I'm going to go with the one, but so specifically on Penn's campus, but this applies to any, good university. Basically, if any of you want to address the idea that for someone keeping silent about, someone's own issues for fear of embarrassment or judgment is sometimes the most popular course of action for students that are under that stress, that are seeing it in a negative light. And then keep it internal and don't ever let that out either with friends or with a counselor or with family. And my question is for all of you, if you were personally approached by a student in a situation, what is your best go-to advice for that person in the moment, and how would you handle that for the future?
So just to be clear, the advice that we would give to somebody who is kind of holding it all in and has been for a while.
Or just, bottling up a lot of emotions. Because I feel like that's a very common thing, at least in Penn, that I've seen people being able to hold things in, and because of other external responsibilities, circumstances, whatever, that don't allow them to get the opportunity to talk about this stuff. And I know, from my personal experience, that holding it in is horrible. It feels like a darkness inside you. But I was wondering, how you all would approach that from your personal backgrounds and experiences.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I appreciate the question. I'll take a quick stab at just one thought I had in response to that. First, I think something that Laura said earlier, I think affirming the moment that you are taking when you are willing to come and speak. I think that we often do that. I do that as much as we've been saying it's easy for physical health for us to walk into the doctor's office. I skip a lot of those appointments too, to be perfectly honest. Because of reasons, right? I'm busy. I've got stuff going on, and if I can push the dentist appointment off for another couple of months, I'm gonna push it. I'm gonna try to get away with that. So I think the first thing I would do in a situation like that is just really affirm the step that the person is taking there, rather than jumping in with, right now we're going to solve all of this stuff and get to the root and the heart of it. But to affirm that and try to encourage you to continue to find ways to talk about what it is that you're dealing with. And I'm sure my friends here can say much more about that from a sort of therapy practice point of view. But the other thing that I would say is, for all of us, and this kind of goes back to the question about supporting friends as well, I think the more that we can normalize talking about the things that we struggle with, and the more that we can encourage reaching out to resources and building supportive relationships, even therapeutic relationships, before we get to that moment of crisis, the more we can make it normal in the way that I really shouldn't be avoiding going to the dentist. I need to make that a part of what I need to do in my sort of healthy year. I think the same is true with thinking about our wellness. That's one of the reasons we've really talked a lot about just creating space for reflection. Whether that's a simple pause in your day, whether that's an intentional 10-minute meditation time in the way that James was describing, whether that's an intentional relationship or conversation that you try to have, creating spaces that are more reflective. And I think you all have that here. the class that I teach, we try to create a space that is that, the interfaith dialogue course. It's a reflective space where you can talk and share and feel heard. And I know, James, you were saying your classes offer some of that as well. Those can seem like little things, and they're not directly related to the moment of crisis that you're describing, but I think if we can normalize that sort of thing, maybe we can work to get away from that norm of pushing it all down. Now, maybe if others want to say more.
Well, yes, I find myself in deep agreement. I think an interesting question in that context is not only why, like, this person is, pushing these things down, and do we need to find a way for them to receive perhaps clinical support and so forth? Yes. And what is it about the way we're living our lives that allows things to get to that point? So if we can have more, if we live our lives differently, if we structure things differently in classes, in our dormitories, in our living environments and so forth, then we can maybe allow for communications to happen on a more regular basis before it gets to be such an entrenched kind of, I can't talk about this anymore, right? Imagine, you get a scratch on your finger and you do nothing about it and it gets infected and then finally it becomes this thing that could threaten your life, right? And so I think that what our experience has been in the Pursuit of Happiness class is, there were 162 students in the class, and we met once a week, and then they met in recitation sections once a week in groups of 10 or 11 with a TA. And so they were working through specific exercises, like identifying their strengths and using them in new ways and so forth, or developing gratitude practices and so on. And what we found at the end of the semester, and what they've said, is that it allowed for a space where they could be vulnerable. Because they are meeting with people over and over again. Initially, they were strangers, but and there was one student yesterday who shared in front of her 161 peers, I realized as a result of this process that I can let out what's inside. It was almost uncannily exactly what you're asking, right? So I feel like it is an individual issue, and it's also a community issue. So how can we invite and make, not require somebody, but almost make it just kind of natural for people to be able to talk about things or to make sure that their scratch gets attended to before it turns into something that's life-threatening.
I would just add one more thing. I don't know, is anyone in here a Dorothy Day fan, or is it just me? Okay, good. Well, Dorothy Day was a famous Catholic figure. He did a lot of social service stuff. And the person that inspired her is a guy named Peter Morin, who was sort of like a street philosopher. And his whole premise that inspired her work was this idea that he wanted to live in a world where it was easier for people to be good. And so what I would say, as someone who hears a lot about what's happening underneath the beautiful, incredible experiences at Penn, is that there's so much pain and suffering, and so much of that is coming from this idea that it's only me, and everyone else is functioning perfectly, wonderfully, they're happy. And so one of the reasons why, the Me Too movement, got so much steam is the power of hearing other people say Me Too. Once you hear someone say Me Too, you'll hear 3 or 4, 5 or 6, 10,000, 20, it just snowballs. And so your question is paradoxical in that I think what really helps is kind of thinking about the power of revealing part of what you're carrying, that there's energy that gets unleashed when you're willing to kind of show your pain. You'll find that people will be willing to show their pain, and whether that leads you to therapy or to a group or to the gym or to a movie, you're no longer in that darkness. So it's difficult, but thanks.
Yeah, I just want to add one last observation. While individuals will, on their own, experience this darkness, and most, if not all, will reach a junction where they can rid themselves of this and share their distress. But individuals together form a culture, and then there's the issue of perfectionism that permeates at this school and at Drexel and at other schools. And it's not just that college students are flawed because they struggle with Penn face or the Stanford duck, and every school has a cute name for it, but this self-imposed desire to be perfect all the time, which is sadly reinforced by social media, because you look at Instagram posts and everybody's living their best life, except you, of course, so then you feel worse about yourself. And the data has shown, like, the more time you spend on social media, the worse you feel about yourself. And then social media has also changed the way our brain works. Our brain has become reactive. Our brain has this FOMO thing going on, right? Where you always have a fear of missing out, or you always feel that you need to know the latest right away. You're afraid that if you don't find out, that somehow you'll miss out on something important. So we've become a reactive society, and that is part of the problem, because we've eliminated space to reflect. And that's what I wanted to kind of arc back to. This is how all these things come together. There is a student group at Penn called Penn Reflect, whose premise is very simple, but extremely effective. It says, we're going to create space to sit down together and talk about a topic and reflect together. And I don't have data to show you, but I would venture to say they're rewiring the brain the way it was supposed to be. It's kind of like going to the gym and exercising a muscle that had just kind of gone dormant because you just weren't using it before. And we have that power. We can change FOMO into JOMO. We can develop the joy of missing out, right? We can develop space and time for ourselves and say, I rewarded myself because I took 10 minutes just to be reflective. Like, we have the power to do that. I have the power to do that by myself. You have the power, but if we all do it together, we can change things. We can change expectations, and ultimately, maybe that's how this preoccupation with face and facelift, and we can change it. So that's kind of like, as I was listening to you and I was listening to my colleagues here, like, these things are all really tied together. It's not a Penn problem. There's a problem with the way society and social media and technology have changed our brains and the way we have or don't have skills and tools to react or to reflect, so on and so forth. So I really welcome your question. That was really great.
Thanks for all of the.
Sorry, Patrick, I just wanted to say one last thing. Or you probably were.
No, I'm not going to finish that.
Okay.
I was going to piggyback off of this, so if you might be piggybacking off of it as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow on what Steve said. Even as I was thinking of saying this, my heart already started to beat. And just to say very openly, I also went to a counselor, and it's great. Really good. And being vulnerable, it's not right now, it's difficult. You have to overcome that. I'm the pastor, whatever the thing, like 7,000 calculations. And I think it's really important to overcome those fears because it's so liberating. It's really, really good. And maybe this small example might help you today or in 10 years' time to say, hey, look, I'm struggling. I'm not going to wait this to threaten my life because I got a small little cut. I better address it earlier than later. That's like the ABC, we all know that earlier is really difficult to overcome that barrier. I experienced it very heavily, and once I did it, it was like, oh, at last, it's like this thing that. And the thing that I wanted to connect with this is also in the holistic realm, just to throw a question, because this wasn't a question, in the holistic realm, also the spiritual realm, like overcoming the fear of asking for spiritual direction, or asking about this issue or that issue. Like overcoming these barriers is so liberating, and I don't know if you have a comment on the spiritual component of this, but it also helps to be able to have a healthy, body, mind, and spirit person.
I have to speak before Steve this time. I'm learning. Then you can. So I direct and teach in the Master of Applied Positive Psychology program here at Penn. And in my class last weekend, we invited Ken Pargament to speak. And Ken Pargament is a researcher on religious coping, sacred moments, and in particular, he's doing work now on the way he defines spirituality is the quest for the sacred, or the search for the sacred. And so, like any search, it's something that sometimes you're looking, sometimes you're finding, sometimes you're integrating, and it's a living kind of journey. And I found, and my students also found his approach really powerful because it allows for openness in terms of what we consider to be sacred. And that may shift in different times in our lives, right? And so there may be at times where we, have greater access to nature, and so we find more of a sense of the sacred in nature. Maybe not as much at Penn or Drexel because we're kind of further from nature than we've probably been at other points in our lives. But the importance of making time for that search. And oftentimes we're so caught up in checking the latest social media feeds or in checking our to-do list or in getting going that we don't allow that time, as you were saying, Benoit, for the reflection, right? And so one of the things that I invited my students to do, and I'll invite you to do too, is just to consider, what is it that I hold sacred? And getting back to what you were saying too, Steve, about that other, it was Rohr, I think you said, that like that other, Richard Rohr, that other kind of reality that we know what that's like, that kind of deeper, more connected sense. But if we're so busy, it's like we're skiing on the surface of the water and we don't give ourselves time to sink down into those depths. So being really intentional about what we hold sacred, why it's important to us, and what we can do to cultivate that relationship with the sacred, I think is all incredibly important.
So, just as you were talking, James, I was thinking about, so I actually brought some notes here from a lecture I heard recently by Miroslav Volf, who's a theologian at Yale. And he was talking a lot about some of the things we're talking about on Penn's campus and how he sees that not just in his students at Yale, but also in faculty at Yale, and just this perpetual motion that we're all so caught up with. And what I was really struck by was he started his talk by saying that he'd come to speak in praise of contentment. And I kind of turned that phrase over in my head for a little while and thinking, what does he mean by contentment? And his sense was that, in all of the places that most of us exist with the speed of life today, we're expected to be growing all the time, learning all the time. There's always more we can be doing. And therefore there's a bit of an existential sense of dissatisfaction because we're never quite there. We never reach the end point. There's always somebody who's maybe a little further ahead. And that's how Yale professors feel. That's how Penn professors feel. So of course the rest of us feel that way. And as he said it, really unless you're an insufferable narcissist, you're going to have that kind of experience at some point in your life. So he said he came to speak in praise of contentment, which is maybe not something that we talk a lot about, because it sounds like we're settling, and I think we've all been encouraged to aim for the best and perform at our best in all times. And really, what he was talking about was a balance between those two things, finding ways that we express that contentment, looking around and being aware of the beauty around us, and really intentional about that. And so, as we've been talking about that and thinking about that more since it was a Lenten series that I heard him speaking in, so it was really just a few weeks ago. Been thinking about what kinds of spiritual practices, what kinds of things that I've been taught in my church and other spiritual places that I've been part of lend themselves to encouraging me to be more content in my daily life. And it's simple things that come right from Scripture and come right from the teachings that I've had from my church and straight from the mouth of Jesus. When Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount the idea that consider the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. They can be content where we are, but we worry, we're anxious. And then Paul in Thessalonians says we should be joyful always and give thanks in all circumstances. What would it look like if we were intentionally thankful more often? What if we just started more of our gatherings by saying, what are you thankful for? Maybe that would be a chance to stop and be reflective and bring a different mode of thinking into our lives. Maybe that would be a way of prioritizing contentment. And that doesn't mean we're not also able to reach our best performance in so many of the things that we're able to do. In fact, I think it would empower a lot of our performance. Yeah, so that's just some spiritual reflection along those lines.
Yeah, so a little bit, you and what you just talked about, Steve, as well as going back to what you spoke about perfectionism. Something I've only been on Penn's campus for 2 years, and I sort of arrived when the campus conversation was already happening, and clearly that was after several years of some pretty tragic occurrences that even continued part of the time that I've been on campus. But I like how you say that it's not just a Penn problem, and clearly that, as society as a whole, from like the day that, kids are born, their parents are already sort of with expectations and, putting, certain pressures that they want their children to be a certain way. And I think, most of us that have grown up, facing that in one way or the other. So, it's not something that probably Penn itself can solve, obviously. That being said, for a healthy organism, if there are signs of illness, that, perhaps even as part of the whole societal system, Penn and other institutions like it are contributing to that environment of, an already innate societal perfectionism when, you're already choosing the best of the best, and everybody that gets here, there is a common experience of like, well, I'm just another fish in the pond, but I feel like, there's all these stressors from my classes and my grades, and I have to be in how many clubs, and, I have to build it's been impressive for me. I've never seen anything like it. I went to a measly school out in Illinois, so I didn't have to worry about this, but it's like, there was a junior here in my first semester that every time at one of these dinners, I saw him carrying the suits, and he was a Wharton student because he had to be going from interview to interview because he was so worried about getting an internship after that junior year, because if he didn't, then heaven forbid what would happen when you graduate without having had a really prestigious internship. So, clearly, like, beyond or just part of that whole societal reality, I remember, when, being at some of the campus conversations when they're asking, well, what do you guys think? And I don't know that Penn or any of these other institutions, how willing they would be to renounce to some like ultimate, sort of search for prestige, that might, like from an environmental standpoint be contributing, in a significant way to what's already a bigger problem that goes beyond that, obviously. So I don't know who that would be directed to, but you guys have any thoughts?
Well, I guess you kept the simple question for last. So you bring an interesting paradox, right? So how, on the one hand, can we tackle a culture of perfectionism, while on the other hand, we are also striving to achieve eminence and create, the next Nobel Prize and so on and so forth. I would venture to say that these two things are not mutually incompatible. There is a way for pleasure, enjoyment, and reflectiveness to coexist with ambition and pushing oneself to go to one's limits. It's about dosing. And I think the dosing apparatus is broken because we are only focused on one thing and not the other. we can fix this dosing mechanism, but we need to be patient with ourselves and realize that it's going to be a process. There's not just a switch that we need to tighten a few things on. We're going to have to start and look at, how do we sell our school? Do we only sell our school as the place for eminence, or do we share our core values of community, character, and ambition, right? So maybe it's about equalizing or broadening our message so that it's more reflective of our values, not just what the shiny objects are on campus. So maybe that means it'll take 4 years, to change the culture, because the people who will have heard this message, who we will have attracted, will be the next generation, so on and so forth. But that's not the entire problem, because what about the faculty who are here because they want to be at this prestigious institution? So we have to not just focus on students, but also remember that we're in a system. There's faculty and there's staff, so we have to tackle this together. Faculty are stressed out. They don't talk about it all the time. Tenure is a big deal. Promotion is really grueling. And we need to make sure that our faculty have a place where they reclaim their agency in this process and say, hey, who made up these rules? Like, it's just not possible for me to publish 45 papers in 2 years. I made up the numbers, but there has to be a place, or maybe I didn't, because I'm not sure. But it's grueling, right? So we need to make sure the faculty also reclaim their agency in the process that is sometimes really cutthroat. We will do this collectively as a community. Obviously, the efforts have been put onto students, and I think that was the appropriate first step. But thinking we're done, just because we're focusing on students, is actually setting us up to fail. There is commitment from the president and the provost of the institution to take a stepwise approach to first provide opportunities for students to develop the skills and tools they need in order to be able to integrate competing demands and feel good about it, to achieve a state of flow and thrive. And there's one thing you said, students don't have to join 7 clubs. Students choose to join 7 clubs because their friends told them they needed to join 7 clubs, right? So students need to be reminded of their own agency in this process and how they perpetuate certain demands. They are allowed to say, no, I think that 3 is fine, right? This is not an institutional policy, it's a culture that's created in a parallel fashion. All of this to say that you've essentially isolated for us like the giant question. And this giant question is going to entail hard work from all constituents, students, faculty, and staff. And I am confident that we'll figure this out. We have to be patient with ourselves, and we have to be deliberate in the way we approach it.
May I ask a question now? I was just going to make an observation, and this is something I've learned in my years of experience in practicing law. There is a tremendous difference between striving for excellence and being a perfectionist. You can strive for excellence, but let's say you finally have a brief prepared, and you notice there are 1 or 2 typos in it, or there's a punctuation error. Instead of redoing the thing and spending another 3 hours and going to bed at 3 in the morning, maybe it's midnight, but you say, okay, this is definitely good enough, this is an excellent product. Yes, someone may notice minor imperfections, but so what? It's not going to influence the result. Well said.
Indeed, well said. And I want to combine those 2 questions. To my mind, it all comes down, perhaps a bit self-servingly, to the pursuit of happiness. And here's why I say that. We have this, in the Declaration of Independence, this is indicated as an inalienable right, along with life and liberty. It's really considered to be incredibly important. The problem is, we spend almost no time learning how to pursue happiness effectively. And so oftentimes, what we do is we just kind of pick up what's around us, as Benoit said. And we think that these bars that are set, or we perceive to be set, external to us, are what we need to be happy. So these are extrinsic motivations. And it's really hard to live your life driven by extrinsic motivations, because they're not really things you care about. It's not that you want to be in all these 7 clubs, it's just you think you ought to be. You'd be embarrassed to go home and tell your friends you're only in 6, right? And that doesn't fuel you. That then makes it seem like, okay, there's this impossible standard and I'm trying to get it, it's hard work. The pursuit of happiness, I think, when done more effectively, is about intrinsic motivation. It's about exploring one's own interests and passions. And so you can have 2 lawyers staying up till midnight preparing a brief, and one extrinsically motivated, hating every minute of it, but fearful that if you don't stay up until midnight and get it at least more or less right, you'll be fired or you'll be embarrassed and so forth. Or you could have another lawyer who is working on a cause she or he believes in and believes that their work will change the world and is happy and energized to stay up until midnight. So it all depends, I think, on the question why we're doing this. And again, I think that we don't do a very good job ourselves or in our communities of asking these questions. How is it that we can pursue happiness more effectively? Not by trying to keep up with what we think is happening, on our social media feeds, not by keeping up on what we think these standards might be, but on getting to know ourselves better and communicating with our friends, helping them to get to know themselves better, and vice versa, trying to understand what it is that really fuels us so that we can follow our own interests and at the same time find something purposive that will make a real difference in the world. That's worth staying up till midnight for.
So I've been thinking a lot about being proactive, and obviously if someone is in a dark place and needs help, they needs to go to a counselor. But do you guys know of any resources that students or any people of our generation could turn to for help? I know Headspace does a really good job with meditation, and I know the whole self-help industry is a billion-dollar industry kind of preying on young people to buy another face mask for that quick fix. But do you know of any other companies that are doing a good job like Headspace that would be a good resource?
Are you looking at? Do you have them? Yes. So there's actually an online program that has been developed, evidence-based, and been developed by some graduate students, and they're currently creating an app called Enhance. And it's an acronym. I don't remember off the top of my head what each thing stands for, but each one of them is an evidence-based practice, skill that you can learn for supporting well-being. And those who are working, so that there's now researchers are now looking to see what the actual effects are from people using this. And so Ed and Carol Diener, they're leading researchers in the domain of wellness and well-being. And they came and gave a presentation last year at CAPS about this program. And my understanding now, and you'll know more, Laura, is that CAPS staff are now looking at it to evaluate it. It's taken longer than anticipated to create the app, but my understanding is that in a few months' time, that app should be available, and depending on the review that CAPS staff do of it, the early indicators are that there's a really good fit. There may be something exactly like that will be available through CAPS. In part, let's say you want to make an appointment, but you can't get in for a week. Well, here's something you can do. Or let's say you've gone through a course of therapy. Here's something you can do to continue, moving on. Or if you don't come in, it's something that you could do. So I'm not real up on the latest of what's going on about that, but I think it's exactly what you're talking about. Susie, do you want to add?
I was just saying, what about the cursoric courses? Do you want to mention that you and Marty and Anna and Duckworth and some of them, would that
Yeah, thank you. So there's, so through LPS, the College of Liberal and Professional Studies at Penn, there's a Coursera specialization. Do you guys know about Coursera? This is a platform for online courses. So there's a specialization in positive psychology that I think that's a great suggestion, Susie, would be a very nice place to start. Marty Seligman has done one of the courses. I've done one of the courses. Karen Rivage. And so there are 4 or 5 courses available there, specialization in positive psychology.
Just one observation about self-help. It's great if there's an app that will help you, but I would rather you do something with somebody else. So I would urge you to find a way that whatever it is you do and whatever you reach for is also community building. Because remember, on college campuses, isolation is a very, very common experience. And whatever self-care modality, whether it's emotional health, physical health, spiritual health, environmental health, like it doesn't matter which domain, but if it's also an opportunity to build community, to find innate support, I think that's like you're able to accomplish 2 things at once, as opposed to just like one single aim or mission.
So I think we may have time for one more question, if anybody would like.
Yeah, right.
I think you're going to take this into well, but what are things that you guys do for self-care for yourself, if you don't mind sharing, and what internally motivates you?
I've been waiting for someone to ask my whole life. What was the second part? What do I do and why do I do it?
So like, what do you do for mental health for you guys, and what personally do you guys do? And then also, what internally motivates you in your day-to-day life?
Gotcha. So yeah, for myself, this sometimes is very shocking for Penn students, but I do see a therapist every week. And when students recoil at that, because it may seem like upsetting that I also see a therapist, but then I tell them, like, I don't want to go to a dentist who doesn't go to a dentist. You know, like, you don't know what you're doing. Like, you don't know anything about oral health, Debbie. So, I mean, that for me is foundational. It's just to have that space that everyone's been sort of naming about, like reflecting and thinking about my life, reaching out for help. How can I ask someone else to be vulnerable if I don't know what it's like to sit in that space and try to be vulnerable myself? So that's one thing. Another thing is Nicole has been helping me learn how to surf for several years. And so for me, that's like my greatest way to restore like my mind, body, and spirit all at the same time, and practice deep, anti-fragile, deep failure, deep difficulty, and like joy and happiness, because when I fall, it doesn't hurt. So those are probably the 2 main things. And then for me, what internally motivates me is I just really, I care about people, and I love to have fun, and I love to think about the deeper parts of being alive. And so whether I'm thinking about myself or thinking about someone I just met or a student I've been working with for years, I just think about that aspect. And so I'm motivated to be in relationship, and to be in relationship requires vulnerability and connection, and you can't do that alone. So that's what motivates me.
Always best to speak before Steve. That's what I learned in taking away from tonight. So I already mentioned the exercise and the mindfulness meditation that I do because I've been taking this class. So as I have thought over the years about what I really love, what just really energizes me, I've come up with 3 things. And I'm a little bit hesitant to share these with you because when I was in college, I may not have been able to say them, and so I don't want to put pressure on you, like, oh, I have to know what my ultimate loves are. But they're interests that you are cultivating. The more you're kind of thinking about and aware of these things, the more you can identify the kinds of things that really energize you. So one thing that really energizes me is learning. I love ideas. I just love ideas and I love to learn. Another thing that I find really deeply energizing and meaningful is connection, intimacy, like really connecting with another human being or some deeper part of myself or the world or being. And third, I'm a frustrated actor. So I love theater, I love audiences, so ideas, intimacy, audiences. Like for me, teaching a course that involves ideas and really being real with each other about well-being and has a theatrical, like a group aspect to it, it's like, oh my goodness, this is like 3 desserts all in one. Another way of putting it is an event like this is great because we're talking about ideas, we're coming together in an open and vulnerable way, and it's a group of people that is doing it. So, man, it doesn't get much better than a Newman dinner.
So the thing I've really learned about myself and self-care in the last few years is that I have a tendency to sort of boom and bust cycles in lots of parts of my life, and including sort of self-care and spiritual wellness. And that shows up for me in kind of like a New Year's resolution kind of mentality to whatever it is that I see in myself that I need to improve or work on and grow. And that's been destructive for me over the years. Like most New Year's resolutions kind of peter out around January 17th or something. So there's actually a realization I had in talking to a friend of mine who's written a book, interestingly enough, about Bible reading strategies. I'm sorry to be really on brand for the chaplain's office tonight, but he talks about this. One of the sort of New Year's resolution things that is common in Christian spaces is you think, oh, this is going to be the year I'm going to read the whole Bible. I probably should have done that. I'm going to make my way through. I'm going to start in Genesis and get all the way to the end. And he said the same dynamic happens. People tend to bog down usually in like Leviticus, Deuteronomy, if you're really tough, make it a little further. And he came up with he wrote a book called The Essential Bible Guide, which is 100 readings that gets you from the beginning to the end. You don't necessarily read every word, but it's achievable. And I think I learned about myself that I need to find small, achievable steps in this kind of arena, because otherwise I just hit myself over the head with brilliant ideas that fizzle out. So the kinds of things that I've been doing for self-care, and they've really been encouraged by community. There's a group that meets in our space on Thursday afternoons that's actually comes from a Catholic group, but it's called the World Christian Meditation Community, and it's a Benedictine group that started it originally. But it's really just been super encouraging to have a 20-minute meditation group that I meet with. There's a mix of staff and students who do that, and in my old guise, I would be thinking, gosh, if I'm not doing this for an hour, why even bother? And it's been transformational for me to feel like I'm doing this thing in small steps. So adding that kind of meditation practice and consistently has been really helpful for me. And I'm doing something similar in kind of physical health, and running, and finding that to be remarkably spiritual as well. And as far as just quickly what motivates me is the people around me, and I feel like internally what motivates me is the passage in Scripture that says that we love because He first loved us. And I try to start my days by thinking, I've been loved in so many different ways by the people around me. How do I turn around and do the same to others? But even something like that's again that big idea that I'm trying to achieve, and I've got to find small, manageable ways to do that as well, and give myself credit along the way for those small, manageable things that I am able to actually do.
First, I want to commend you for your question, because it's important when we talk about these things that we don't just talk the talk, but we walk the walk. And for the four of us to come and say, oh, like all these fancy words, but then we can't answer your question then. So I think it's great that you asked us this question. I'm going to answer in reverse order, because I struggle, like, wait, why do I get up every morning? What drives me? And I realized that, so I went to medical school. I wanted to be a doctor. I take great pride and I'm very humbled by my healing ability, right? I wanted to be a healer. I wanted to help people. And through medical school, I discovered that it was through psychiatry that I found it to be most fulfilling. I liked all of medical school, but psychiatry didn't feel like work for me. So that's why I pursued psychiatry. I'm like, oh, well, at least I won't be burnt out after a few years if it doesn't feel like work. And when I was offered this job, right, this job came out of a clear blue sky. I was perfectly happy being a psychiatrist here, seeing patients, teaching at the medical school. And when I was offered this position, initially I went into the interview process just because I was flattered. I'm like, oh, this is like free ego therapy. Of course I'll talk to you. Sure, I'll talk to you on the phone again. Like, oh, fine. But then by the end of the process, I realized, oh, I think I actually not only am interested and not only can I do this, but I really want to do this because it will allow me to achieve the same goals, but on a broader scale. So rather than have an impact with one person in my office for a 45-minute session, maybe the decisions I make can have an impact on a population, on lots of people. And that to me is very attractive, to be given an opportunity to be an agent to make things better. Still in the healing spirit, but just on a different stage, and that's what drives me. Now, how do I do self-care? Well, it's important that you know my professional trajectory because my self-care has changed. I used to love to immerse myself in books. I can't do that so much anymore because my usage of time has radically changed. There's not a hidden complaint in there, it's just factual. So I've had to really look and adapt, like what's my antidote? How do I keep everything balanced and take care of myself? I had a milestone birthday a few months ago, and I realized, oh, my body needs a little bit more of a tune-up. So I now go to group trainings. And I'm not a gym person, like I don't talk about the gym all the time, and I don't have protein supplements in my home. But I will tell you, like I love going to the gym, and I train with the same group of people, and I push myself to do things that I didn't think I was able to do, and that has become my new form of self-care. And it's totally, I'm not stressed out at all when I leave the gym. I'm like, oof, this was exhausting, I feel so much better. And I'm achy and I'm sore. But it's also that even though, like, if we had met a year ago, I'd have said, oh, like this is the latest book I read, and it was just so wonderful to embark on this journey and become attached to these characters. I can't do that anymore, so I've had to adapt. I've had to change the way that I take care of myself, and I think that's an important message as part of the question that you asked us. The last thing is that I still do, though, is I force myself every day to journal, and it's kind of like a variation on the gratitude journaling, and I structure it this way. Every day, at the end of the day, I ask myself, what today surprised me? What today touched me? And what today inspired me? And this is how I structure my reflection at the end of the day. And I'm sharing this with you specifically because this Newman dinner has inspired me. That's what I will be writing about when I journal today. So thank you.